people were going to say, what happened to you? You gave up several millions of dollars?
At 81, Pernell Roberts dropped a bombshell confession few knew he felt. The actor who starred as Adam Cartwright on Bonanza said goodbye at the peak, not because of health, but because he despised the show's mindless scripts. Yet his revelation goes deeper, darker, and more unexplored. And it might just rewrite how we see one of television's icons. Here's the thing, nobody really tells you. Pernell Roberts was never meant to be a cowboy on television. Long before Bonanza made him a household name, he was a restless soul with roots in Shakespearean theater. He was trained in the classics, reciting Hamlet and Othello, and for him, television westerns felt like junk food after fine dining. When Hollywood tossed him into the saddle as Adam Cartwright, he instantly knew he was trapped in a role that millions adored, but he secretly despised. To Roberts, Adam was nothing more than a middle-aged teenager. That was the cutting phrase he used to describe the shallow writing, the recycled stories, and the endless "yes sir, no sir" lines to his on-screen father. Imagine an artist craving depth, only to be fed scripts he felt were insulting to both actor and audience. Fans saw a brooding, handsome rancher, but behind the scenes, Roberts was seething, convinced that every new episode was another nail in the coffin of his creative spirit. It wasn't just about ego, it was about principle. Roberts once admitted he found it painful that the show ignored storylines. He looked around at the cast, saw men who had accepted comfort and fame, and realized he couldn't do it. His co-stars were enjoying success. He felt suffocated by it. This resentment festered. He grew combative with producers, questioning lines, cutting dialogue, and even mocking the scripts during rehearsals. While audiences thought Adam Cartwright was the strong, moral son every father wished for, Pernell Roberts believed the role was draining him of his dignity as an actor. And so, even while he was one of the most recognizable faces on television, he was plotting an escape. Roberts wasn't chasing stardom. He was chasing authenticity. And that pursuit would lead him to a decision so shocking, even his castmates couldn't believe it when it happened. But what exactly pushed him over the edge and caused him to walk away from the biggest show on television at its peak? The answer would ignite both admiration and outrage. By the mid-1960s, Bonanza was unstoppable. It was topping ratings, earning millions, and becoming a cultural giant. For most actors, this was the dream: steady paychecks, worldwide recognition, and immortality on the small screen. But for Pernell Roberts, it was a nightmare dressed as success. He had reached the very summit of television fame, and yet he felt nothing but contempt for it. Behind the glossy image of the Cartwright family, tension was boiling. Roberts had grown tired of what he called banal dialogue and paper-thin morality tales. He would storm into script readings, openly criticize the writers, and demand changes. Some crew members said he was difficult. Roberts insisted he was fighting for dignity. He couldn't stand the way Adam Cartwright was written as the obedient son who never challenged anything. In his mind, the role was a straitjacket. The breaking point came when Roberts realized the show would never change. NBC executives wanted Bonanza to stay family-friendly, simple, and safe. That meant no controversial storylines, no explorations of race, class, or real conflict, things Roberts believed television should dare to tackle. To him, the Cartwrights were just cowboys living in a sanitized fantasy land, never touching the real struggles of the American West. He once said bluntly that Bonanza was phony, and that word spread like wildfire in Hollywood. Quitting Bonanza wasn't just career suicide, it was unthinkable. He was walking away from a role that millions adored, from a paycheck worth thousands every week, and from the stability every actor dreams of. But Roberts didn't care. He compared himself to an artist being forced to paint the same dull picture over and over again. His soul was burning out, and he would rather risk obscurity than live in creative slavery. And so, in 1965, at the height of Bonanza's dominance, Pernell Roberts did the unthinkable. He left. No big farewell, no long goodbye, just a sudden exit that stunned fans and infuriated executives. His co-stars were shocked. His agents begged him to reconsider, but Roberts stood firm, saying he refused to waste his life trapped in mediocrity. The press, however, wasn't kind. Headlines called him arrogant, ungrateful, and even self-destructive. Some critics said he would never recover from the decision, and for a while, it looked like they were right, because what came next was a gamble that nearly destroyed his career. After slamming the door on Bonanza, Roberts didn't head for Hollywood parties or cushy guest roles. Instead, he threw himself into what he considered real art. He returned to the theater, craving the rawness of live performance and the challenge of classic roles. Shakespeare, Eugene O'Neill, and even experimental stage productions became his new battlegrounds. But the transition wasn't smooth. Audiences who had adored Adam Cartwright weren't always ready to accept Roberts as Hamlet or Macbeth. Critics were brutal, often comparing his stage work unfavorably to his TV stardom. One review even mocked him as a cowboy lost in Shakespeare's world, cutting deep into the ego of a man already fighting to prove himself. For Roberts, though, failure wasn't an enemy, it was fuel. He believed the risk of ridicule was better than the comfort of mediocrity. Still, the rebellion came at a cost. Financial security slipped away. His name faded from television, and opportunities became scarce. Hollywood wasn't eager to hire the man who had publicly trashed one of its biggest hits. Casting directors whispered that he was difficult, and producers feared he'd walk away from projects as easily as he had from Bonanza. For years, Roberts wandered in the wilderness of guest appearances, theater tours, and odd jobs, stubbornly clinging to his artistic ideals. Yet, there was another side to him, an activist's fire that burned just as strong as his artistic pride. During this period, Roberts didn't just retreat into acting, he marched, protested, and put his career on the line for causes most stars avoided. He appeared at civil rights rallies, lending his voice when others stayed silent. This was a man who would rather risk being forgotten than compromise on principle. And though the theater gave him freedom, it also gave him constant disappointment. He was too famous to vanish, but too controversial to thrive. Roberts was caught in a no-man's land, too proud for Hollywood, too raw for Broadway. But just when it seemed like his career might collapse entirely, he made a shocking move back to television. It wasn't a Western this time, it was something far removed from the Ponderosa. Yet it came with its own compromises and a new identity he could never quite escape. While Hollywood painted him as the actor who quit too soon, Pernell Roberts was quietly building a legacy most fans never knew about. Away from the cameras, he became an outspoken activist, something rare in the 1960s, especially for a former TV cowboy. Roberts wasn't content to just recite lines on a soundstage. He wanted his voice to mean something in the real world. In 1965, the same year he walked away from Bonanza, Roberts joined the Selma to Montgomery marches led by Martin Luther King Jr. Imagine that. While his co-stars were filming new episodes, Roberts was marching through Alabama, arm in arm with civil rights leaders, under the threat of violence. He didn't call the press. He didn't make it a publicity stunt. He just showed up because he believed it was right. This wasn't a one-time gesture either. Roberts often criticized Hollywood's failure to represent black actors, calling out studios for their cowardice in telling real stories about race and justice. He took part in rallies, gave speeches, and even turned down roles he felt perpetuated stereotypes. In an era when many actors stayed silent to protect their careers, Roberts risked everything to stand with those demanding change. And yet, this commitment came with consequences. Some producers saw him as too political. Studios whispered that he was a liability, a man who would cause trouble on set. The same industry that had once celebrated him for Bonanza now quietly shut its doors. For Roberts, though, silence was never an option. He believed the point of art, and of life itself, was to confront uncomfortable truths. Even his personal relationships reflected this restless conscience. Friends recalled how Roberts would challenge dinner-table conversations, always pushing people to question assumptions. He wasn't interested in small talk. He wanted debate, fire, and honesty. That intensity made him unforgettable to some, and unbearable to others. But activism doesn't pay the bills. And by the late 1970s, after years of theater and uneven work, Roberts faced a dilemma. He still craved authenticity, but he also needed stability. That's when television came calling again, with a role so different from Adam Cartwright that it shocked everyone. But was this comeback really a victory, or the ultimate compromise? When Pernell Roberts returned to television in 1979, it wasn't in a cowboy hat, but in a surgeon's gown. Trapper John, MD, premiered to huge audiences, casting Roberts as the older, wiser version of the character first seen in MASH. For many, it was the perfect comeback. The show ran for 7 seasons, gave him steady income, and restored his visibility in an industry that had nearly written him off. But here's the twist. Roberts himself had mixed feelings about it. To him, Trapper John was safer, more grounded than Bonanza, but it still wasn't the artistic challenge he craved. He often described it as good work, but not great art. Fans adored the compassionate surgeon who balanced medical drama with personal wisdom, yet Roberts quietly admitted he sometimes felt he was just repeating the same hospital stories in endless variations. Still, this role gave him something he hadn't had in years: stability. After wandering between stage productions, small guest roles, and activism, Trapper John offered consistency. His financial struggles eased, and for the first time since leaving Bonanza, he was back on the map as a household name. But stability can be its own trap. Roberts often told friends he worried he had traded his freedom for comfort, exactly the fate he had once sworn to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had walked away from Bonanza at the height of its fame because he refused to be chained to banality. And yet, here he was, 2 decades later, once again locked into a long-running TV series, repeating storylines, and wearing a professional mask. This time, though, he didn't leave. Perhaps age had tempered his rebellion. Perhaps he realized that some battles couldn't be fought forever. Still, Roberts never let the show define him. Off-screen, he continued to speak at civil rights events and criticize Hollywood for its lack of progress. To him, Trapper John was just a job, not a legacy. And though fans saw it as a second act of glory, Roberts himself saw it as a compromise, a bargain he struck with the very system he had once rejected. But as the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed on Trapper John, Roberts was left with the one thing he couldn't escape: reflection. And it was in those final years that he made the confession that stunned everyone who thought they understood him. As the years rolled on and the Hollywood spotlight faded, Pernell Roberts found himself confronting the very choices that had defined his career. Friends recall him as restless, even in old age, never content to sit quietly and accept the nostalgia others wanted him to bask in. When fans approached him gushing about Bonanza, he often smiled politely, but privately, he bristled. To him, the show was never the triumph people imagined. It was the cage he had escaped from. In his later interviews, Roberts began peeling back the mask. He confessed that he had carried regrets, not about leaving Bonanza, but about the decades of criticism and misunderstanding that followed. People had called him arrogant, selfish, even foolish. Yet Roberts maintained he left because he believed television had a duty to be better, to challenge audiences rather than lull them. Why settle for mediocrity? He once asked, his voice sharp even in old age. That was the mantra of his life. But there were softer admissions too. Roberts sometimes hinted at loneliness, a side effect of his uncompromising nature. Walking away from Bonanza cost him more than fame. It strained friendships, burned bridges, and left him with a reputation that scared away future opportunities. He admitted that his refusal to bend often left him isolated in an industry built on compromise. It was a bitter truth he carried quietly. Still, Roberts never apologized for standing his ground. Even in his 70s, he called Bonanza a cartoonish fantasy, unworthy of the praise it received. Yet, in the same breath, he admitted he owed his platform to it. Without Adam Cartwright, there would have been no Trapper John, no Broadway credits, no stage to voice his activism. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was forever tied to the very show he despised. And as his health declined, Roberts seemed to grow more candid. He spoke less like a star and more like a man trying to leave behind a final message, one that hinted at a confession he had long avoided. a truth that would only fully surface at the very end. Because when he turned 81, he revealed something so raw, so unexpected, that it shattered the image fans had carried for decades. By the time Pernell Roberts reached his 80s, the world had long made up its mind about him. To fans, he would always be Adam Cartwright, the serious, brooding eldest son of the Ponderosa. No matter how many Shakespearean roles he tackled, no matter how many political marches he joined, and no matter how many years he played Trapper John, history had branded him with one character, and that irony haunted him. Roberts had spent his life fighting to escape the shadow of Bonanza, yet that very shadow became the only thing most people remembered. When journalists wrote about him, the headlines always circled back to Adam Cartwright. When convention organizers invited him, it was for Western nostalgia, not his activism, not his theater, not his artistry. He once admitted in private that it stung to know a lifetime of work could be boiled down to a role he despised. Even his own words came back to haunt him. Those famous lines where he called Adam a middle-aged teenager followed him for decades, quoted in article after article. What had been a sharp critique in the 1960s turned into a permanent label, like graffiti carved into his legacy. It was proof of how little the industry forgave an actor who dared to speak out. And yet, beneath his bitterness, there was a glimmer of pride. Roberts knew he had lived on his own terms. He had not surrendered to the easy comforts of fame. He had not smiled for scripts he hated. He had marched when others stayed silent. And for all the bridges burned, there was integrity in the ashes. He told friends that if he had to do it all over again, he would still walk away from Bonanza. But fate is cruel. History rarely rewards rebels. Instead of being remembered as the actor who stood for artistic integrity, he became the actor who quit too soon. Instead of being celebrated for his courage at Selma, he was remembered for storming off a soundstage. Roberts had fought to control his story, but the world had already written it for him. And yet, in the twilight of his life, he revealed one last confession, one that peeled away the bitterness and exposed the fragile truth beneath the rebellion. At 81, he finally said out loud what so many had suspected all along. In his final years, when illness had slowed his once fiery stride, Pernell Roberts let his guard slip. Friends, caretakers, and a few close confidants recalled that at 81, he finally admitted something shocking, something fans had whispered about for decades. After a lifetime of rebellion, defiance, and disdain for the show that made him famous, Roberts confessed that deep down, he was grateful for Bonanza. It wasn't the gratitude of a man who had changed his mind. He still despised the shallow scripts, still felt suffocated by the role of Adam Cartwright, and still believed television had wasted its chance to inspire. But he admitted that without Bonanza, he never would have had the platform to march beside Martin Luther King Jr., to speak on stages across America, or to demand better from an industry built on compromise. The very show he ridiculed had also been the launchpad for everything else he stood for. Even more startling, Roberts confessed that walking away had haunted him in ways he rarely let the public see. For years, he had told interviewers he had no regrets, but privately, he admitted he sometimes wondered if his stubbornness had cost him more than it gave him. He worried about the friendships lost, the roles that never came, and the audience that never got to see what more he could have done. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had built his image on iron principles. Yet, in the same breath, Roberts also reaffirmed his rebellion. He told those closest to him that if he had stayed, he would have died inside long before his body gave out. To him, the confession wasn't an apology, it was a paradox. He both hated and needed Bonanza. He both resented and respected the role that defined him. He admitted what fans had always suspected, that beneath the anger and the pride, there was a quiet gratitude he had never allowed himself to voice. And then came the final twist, his legacy. Roberts passed away in 2010, remembered by millions not as a crusader for art, but as Adam Cartwright, the role he fought hardest to escape. Yet thanks to that late confession, the story is more complicated than anyone imagined. He wasn't just the man who walked away. He was the man who finally, at 81, made peace with the ghost that followed him his entire life. Because in the end, his greatest confession wasn't that he hated Bonanza, it was that he needed it, and he finally admitted the truth we all suspected all along.